Part 1. The First. Vanishing. October 2018. The morning mist clung to Millbrook's cobblestone streets like a shroud, and Margaret Chen would later remember how unnaturally quiet the town felt that Tuesday morning. She had been walking to the bakery when she noticed the police car parked outside St. Joseph's Church, its red and blue lights painting the Gothic stonework in alternating hues of warning. Tommy Brennan was 12 years old when he disappeared. His mother, Sarah, had dropped him off at the church at 6:30 in the morning for altar boy practice, just as she had every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 8 months. Father Augustine ran a tight schedule. The boys needed to be prepared for the upcoming Harvest Festival Mass, and perfection was expected. When Sarah returned at 8:30 to collect Tommy, she found Father Augustine standing alone in the vestry, his weathered hands folding and refolding a white surplice. The priest's eyes, usually sharp and commanding, seemed distant, unfocused. "Where's my son?" Sarah's voice echoed through the vaulted space. "He left," Father Augustine said simply. "About 20 minutes ago. Said he wasn't feeling well." But Tommy never made it home. His backpack was found 3 days later in Miller's Creek, the notebooks inside still dry and the pages unmarked by water. The police questioned Father Augustine extensively, but his story never wavered. Tommy had complained of stomach pains and asked to go home early. The priest had assumed the boy would walk the 6 blocks to his house, as he had done countless times before. The search lasted 2 weeks. Volunteers combed through the dense woods surrounding Millbrook, their flashlights creating dancing shadows between the pine trees. The county brought in tracking dogs, but they lost Tommy's scent at the church parking lot as if the boy had simply vanished into thin air. Mrs. Chen, who lived across from the church, mentioned to police that she had seen Tommy enter the building that morning but couldn't recall seeing him leave. When pressed, she admitted she hadn't been watching continuously. She had been tending to her garden and only glanced up occasionally. Still, the detail bothered Detective Ray Morrison, who had been investigating missing persons cases for 15 years. In his experience, 12-year-old boys didn't just disappear, especially not from the heart of a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Part 2, The Pattern Emerges. March 2019, November 2020. 5 months after Tommy's disappearance, it happened again. This time it was Marcus Webb, a quiet 13-year-old with thick glasses and a stutter that made him self-conscious around his peers. Marcus had been serving as an altar boy for over a year, and Father Augustine often praised his dedication and attention to detail. The circumstances were eerily similar. Marcus had been dropped off for a Thursday morning practice and had allegedly left early due to feeling unwell. His mother, Linda, found this claim suspicious. Marcus had never complained of illness before practice, and he took his duties at the church seriously, often practicing the Latin responses at home until he could recite them perfectly. Detective Morrison felt a chill of recognition when he arrived at St. Joseph's that March morning. The same mist hung over the town. The same silence seemed to press against the church walls. Father Augustine stood in the same spot in the vestry, his hands folding the same white surplice. "This is quite a coincidence," Morrison said, watching the priest's reaction carefully. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Father Augustine replied, his voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there during Tommy's disappearance. "These boys, they're troubled. Perhaps more than we realized." Marcus's disappearance received more attention than Tommy's. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, and concerned parents began asking questions about the church's supervision policies. A parents' meeting was called, and 37 families crowded into the church basement, their voices creating a nervous hum that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. Father Augustine addressed their concerns with practiced calm. He explained that the boys were free to leave practice if they felt unwell, that he couldn't be expected to escort each child home personally. He reminded them that Millbrook had always been a safe community, that these disappearances were likely unrelated incidents that would resolve themselves in time. But time brought no resolution. Instead, it brought David Kowalski in September 2019, then James Martinez in February 2020, and finally Luke Patterson in November of the same year. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. A boy would arrive for practice, complain of illness, and leave early, only to vanish before reaching home. The parents began to whisper among themselves. They noticed how Father Augustine's explanations had become more elaborate, how he seemed to have specific details about each boy's condition. Tommy's stomach pains, Marcus's headache, David's dizziness. They wondered how a priest could remember such specific ailments months after the fact, especially when he claimed to see dozens of altar boys each week. Detective Morrison's investigation hit dead ends at every turn. The church's records were meticulously maintained, but they seemed almost too perfect. Every attendance sheet was filled out in the same precise handwriting, every entry dated and signed. When Morrison requested to see the church's financial records, Father Augustine produced them immediately, but they revealed nothing unusual: standard donations, utility payments, and maintenance costs. The detective began to suspect that something was being hidden, but he couldn't identify what. The church basement had been searched thoroughly after each disappearance, revealing nothing more than storage rooms filled with Christmas decorations and folding chairs. The main sanctuary, the vestry, and Father Augustine's private quarters had all been examined and found to contain nothing suspicious. Part 3. The Investigation Deepens. 2021. By the spring of 2021, Detective Morrison had been joined by FBI agent Sarah Williams, a specialist in missing persons cases involving minors. Agent Williams brought a different perspective to the investigation. She had seen cases where predators operated within trusted institutions, using their authority and the community's faith to mask their crimes. The FBI's involvement brought new resources and new questions. Agent Williams ordered ground-penetrating radar surveys of the church property, looking for evidence of construction or excavation that might indicate hidden spaces. The results were puzzling. The radar detected several anomalies beneath the church building, including what appeared to be a large chamber that didn't correspond to any known basement or storage area. When confronted with these findings, Father Augustine seemed genuinely surprised. He explained that St. Joseph's had been built in 1889 and had undergone several renovations over the decades. It was possible that earlier construction had sealed off areas that were no longer in use. He provided the FBI with architectural plans dating back to the church's founding, but the documents were incomplete and contradictory. The sixth disappearance occurred in July 2021. Timothy Walsh, age 11, had been serving as an altar boy for only 3 months when he vanished. Unlike the previous cases, Timothy's disappearance was witnessed by another altar boy, 9-year-old Peter Caldwell, who had arrived early for practice. Peter's account was fragmentary and confused. He claimed to have seen Timothy talking to Father Augustine in the vestry, but he couldn't hear what they were discussing. According to Peter, Timothy had seemed upset or frightened, and Father Augustine had placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. Peter had gone to the bathroom, and when he returned, both Timothy and Father Augustine were gone. When questioned, Father Augustine confirmed that Timothy had been distressed about something, family problems he believed, and had asked to go home early. The priest claimed he had walked Timothy to the front door of the church and watched him leave. But Peter's testimony contradicted this. Peter insisted he had looked for both Timothy and Father Augustine throughout the church and hadn't found either of them. The contradiction was significant enough to warrant a more intensive search of the church building. Agent Williams obtained a warrant to examine areas that had been off-limits during previous investigations, including Father Augustine's private study and the church's archives. The study revealed nothing unusual: religious texts, administrative papers, and personal correspondence that seemed entirely normal. The archives, however, contained gaps that troubled Agent Williams. Records from certain years were missing entirely, and other documents appeared to have been deliberately removed or destroyed. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who had witnessed several of the boys entering the church, approached Agent Williams with new information. She had been keeping a journal of her observations, she explained, because the disappearances had made her uneasy. Her notes revealed a pattern that no one else had noticed. On the days when boys disappeared, Father Augustine's car remained in the church parking lot for hours longer than usual. Part 4. The Underground, 2022. The 7th and 8th disappearances occurred within 2 weeks of each other in early 2022. Ryan O'Connor and Michael Jang, both 12 years old, vanished under circumstances that had become grimly familiar to the investigators. The rapid succession of disappearances created panic in Millbrook, and parents began pulling their children out of the altar boy program en masse. Father Augustine announced that the program would be suspended indefinitely, citing the emotional distress it was causing the community. He suggested that the disappearances might be connected to some external threat, perhaps a predator who was targeting the boys because of their association with the church. This theory gained some support among parishioners who preferred to believe that the evil was coming from outside their beloved institution. Agent Williams wasn't convinced. She had been studying the architectural plans of St. Joseph's Church, comparing them to the ground-penetrating radar results. The discrepancies were significant. The radar detected a large space beneath the church that didn't appear on any of the plans. Moreover, the space seemed to be accessible from the church building itself, though the entrance wasn't obvious. A more thorough search of the church's interior revealed the truth. Behind a bookshelf in Father Augustine's study, Agent Williams discovered a door that had been cleverly concealed. The door was old, its wood stained dark with age, and it opened onto a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The staircase led to a chamber that predated the church itself. The room was large, perhaps 40 feet square, with stone walls that wept moisture and a ceiling supported by heavy wooden beams. The space had been modified over the years, electric lighting had been installed, and parts of the floor had been covered with newer concrete. But it was what the chamber contained that made Agent Williams' blood run cold. Along one wall stood 14 small altars, each one crude and simple, each one bearing evidence of recent use. Candles had been burned down to stubs, and wax had pooled on the stone surfaces. The air smelled of incense and something else, something organic and sickly sweet that made the agent's stomach turn. The concrete floor showed signs of recent disturbance. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed what Agent Williams feared. There were remains beneath the concrete. 14 sets of remains that corresponded to the 14 boys who had disappeared over the past 6 years. Part 5. The Confession. Late 2022. Father Augustine was arrested on a cold November morning as he prepared for the 7 o'clock Mass. The few parishioners who had remained loyal to the church watched in stunned silence as the priest was led away in handcuffs, his black cassock billowing in the wind. The excavation of the underground chamber took 3 weeks. Each set of remains was carefully removed and identified through dental records and DNA analysis. The coroner's reports revealed that the boys had died from various causes, some from blunt force trauma, others from what appeared to be ritual injuries. The details were too disturbing to release to the public, but they painted a picture of systematic abuse and murder that had spanned years. Under interrogation, Father Augustine initially maintained his innocence, claiming that he had discovered the chamber only recently and had been trying to determine what to do about it. He suggested that the previous priest, Father O'Malley, who had died in 2018, might have been responsible for the crimes. But the evidence was overwhelming. DNA analysis found traces of several victims in Father Augustine's private quarters, and forensic examination of the underground chamber revealed his fingerprints on the makeshift altars. More damning still, a search of his computer revealed detailed records of each boy's disappearance, including photographs and videos that documented the horrific abuse they had suffered. When confronted with this evidence, Father Augustine's facade finally crumbled. He confessed to the murders, but his explanation was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. He claimed that he had been chosen for a sacred purpose, that the boys had been sacrificed to protect the town from a greater evil. He spoke of ancient rituals and divine commands, of voices that had guided him to select his victims. The confession was rambling and incoherent, filled with religious delusions and references to apocalyptic prophecies. Psychiatrists who examined Father Augustine diagnosed him with severe mental illness, but they couldn't explain how he had managed to function as a priest for so many years while harboring such twisted beliefs. The investigation revealed that Father Augustine had been planning his crimes for years before the first disappearance. He had gradually modified the underground chamber, installing the lighting and constructing the altars. He had studied the routines of the altar boys, identifying those who were most vulnerable and least likely to be immediately missed. The method of the murders was as calculated as the preparation. Father Augustine would convince each boy that he was ill and needed to rest in a quiet place. He would lead them to the hidden chamber, claiming it was a special sanctuary where they could pray for healing. Once the boys were isolated underground, they were trapped. The chamber had no exit other than the concealed staircase. Part 6. The Aftermath, 2023. The trial of Father Augustine became a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the country to the small town of Millbrook. The courtroom was packed daily with family members of the victims, their faces etched with grief and anger. The details that emerged during testimony were so disturbing that the judge cleared the courtroom of spectators on several occasions. Father Augustine was convicted on 14 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no remorse during the sentencing, claiming that his actions had been divinely inspired and that the truth would be revealed in time. The Catholic Church issued statements expressing horror at the crimes and promising full cooperation with ongoing investigations. The diocese announced that St. Joseph's Church would be permanently closed and eventually demolished. The building stood empty for months, its windows boarded up, its bell tower silent. But the story didn't end with Father Augustine's conviction. The families of the victims filed lawsuits against the Catholic Church, alleging that the diocese had failed to properly supervise the priest and had ignored warning signs of his mental instability. The litigation revealed troubling details about Father Augustine's past. He had been transferred to Millbrook from another parish after complaints about his behavior, though the specific nature of those complaints was never made public. More disturbing still were the gaps in the church's records. Files relating to Father Augustine's appointment and supervision were mysteriously incomplete, and several church officials claimed to have no memory of concerns about the priest's conduct. The pattern suggested a deliberate cover-up, though investigators could never prove that church hierarchy had knowledge of the murders. The demolition of St. Joseph's Church began in the spring of 2023. The wrecking crews found additional evidence of Father Augustine's crimes. Personal items belonging to the victims had been hidden throughout the building, and the walls of the underground chamber bore inscriptions that documented the priest's descent into madness. The site where the church had stood was eventually converted into a memorial park. 14 oak trees were planted, each one bearing a plaque with the name of one of the victims. The families hoped that the memorial would provide a place for healing and remembrance, but many residents of Millbrook found it difficult to visit the site where so much suffering had occurred. Part 7. The Questions That Remain, 2024, Present. 2 years after Father Augustine's conviction, Millbrook remains a town haunted by unanswered questions. The most troubling of these concerns, the extent of the conspiracy that enabled the murders. While Father Augustine was clearly the killer, investigators have never been able to determine whether he acted entirely alone. The underground chamber where the murders occurred had been modified over many years, requiring construction work that would have been difficult for one person to complete secretly. The chamber's electrical system was professionally installed, and the concrete floor had been poured with expertise that suggested professional involvement. Yet no contractor ever came forward to admit working on the project, and no records of the construction were ever found. Mrs. Chen, the neighbor who had observed the church for years, provided testimony that raised additional questions. She claimed to have seen delivery trucks at the church on several occasions, usually late at night or early in the morning. The trucks had no identifying markings, and she never saw what was being delivered or removed. When investigators tried to trace these deliveries, they found no records of any legitimate business having made such deliveries to the church. The missing church records also suggest a broader conspiracy. The gaps in the files were too systematic to be accidental, and they seem to coincide with periods when Father Augustine was exhibiting his most disturbing behavior. Someone with access to the church's administrative systems had deliberately removed evidence, but the identity of that person was never determined. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the accounts of other parishioners who, in the aftermath of the arrests, began to remember strange incidents they had previously dismissed. Several parents recalled their children mentioning that Father Augustine had shown them special places in the church, though the children had been sworn to secrecy about these locations. Other altar boys reported that Father Augustine had asked them unusual questions about their families and home lives, as if he were evaluating their suitability for some unknown purpose. The psychological evaluation of Father Augustine revealed that he had been suffering from severe mental illness for years, possibly decades. His delusions about divine commands and apocalyptic prophecies had developed gradually, and it was unclear when his religious beliefs had crossed the line into dangerous obsession. The psychiatrists who examined him suggested that his condition might have been triggered by some traumatic event, but they were never able to identify what that event might have been. The Catholic Church's response to the murders has been criticized by victims' advocates and investigative journalists. While the diocese expressed appropriate horror at the crimes, their cooperation with the investigation was limited, and many documents that might have shed light on Father Augustine's background were never released. The Church claimed that these documents were protected by religious privilege, but critics argued that the privilege should not extend to covering up criminal activity. Epilogue: the silence that follows. Today, Millbrook appears to be a normal small town, its streets quiet, and its residents going about their daily lives. But those who lived through the horror of the disappearances know that the town will never truly recover from what happened at St. Joseph's Church. The memorial park where the church once stood is rarely visited. The 14 oak trees grow taller each year, the branches creating shadows that seem to move even when there is no wind. Children walking to school take a different route to avoid passing the site, and their parents don't question this choice. Detective Morrison retired shortly after Father Augustine's conviction. He had worked missing persons cases for 20 years, but he admitted that this investigation had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain. He moved to a different state, seeking distance from the memories of those 14 boys in the underground chamber where their lives had ended. Agent Williams returned to FBI headquarters, but she continued to investigate similar cases across the country. She had become convinced that Father Augustine's crimes were not unique, that other trusted figures in other communities might be committing similar atrocities. Her subsequent investigations revealed patterns that suggested a network of predators operating within religious institutions, though she was never able to prove definitive connections. The families of the victims have tried to move on with their lives, but the scars remain. Some have left Millbrook entirely, unable to live in a place that holds so many painful memories. Others have stayed, determined to ensure that their sons are not forgotten and that nothing like this ever happens again. The underground chamber beneath the former church has been filled with concrete and sealed permanently. The city council voted to ensure that no trace of the room would remain, hoping that burying the physical evidence might help the community heal. But some residents whisper that evil like this cannot be simply buried and forgotten, that the darkness that consumed Father Augustine might have left a stain on the town that will never fully fade. The most disturbing question remains unanswered. How many other Father Augustines are out there, operating in the shadows of trusted institutions, protected by the very faith and authority that should make them guardians of the innocent? The investigation revealed how easily a predator could operate within a religious community, how the trust and reverence accorded to a priest could be weaponized against the most vulnerable members of society. In the end, the story of the 14 altar boys who disappeared from St. Joseph's Church is not just a tale of one man's descent into madness and evil. It is a warning about the danger of blind faith, the importance of questioning authority, and the need to listen when children try to tell us that something is wrong. The bells of St. Joseph's Church will never ring again, but their silence speaks louder than any sound. It reminds us that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades, that those who claim to serve God can sometimes serve only their own twisted purposes. And it warns us that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones that lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings, but the ones that stand at the altar, wearing the robes of respectability and speaking in the voice of divine authority. The 14 boys who died in that underground chamber will never grow up, never have families of their own, never fulfill the dreams that were stolen from them. But their story serves as a testament to the importance of vigilance, of protecting the innocent, and of never allowing trust to become a shield for evil. In Millbrook, the morning mist still clings to the cobblestone streets, and the silence still presses against the empty spaces where faith once flourished. But now that silence carries a different meaning. It is not the peace of a quiet town, but the hollow echo of questions that will never be fully answered, and the lingering presence of an evil that was allowed to flourish in the shadows of sanctity.